through the church, not to the church, but through the church. And some of you have already given that offering, and some of you have not. And I encourage you to be a part of that in helping us to support this family and others who are spreading the gospel around the world. Our church is involved with that too. We have a group that's going to be going to Nicaragua next year, and then we just got approved last week to go to Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and so you'll be hearing about that too. And there's other trips in the making, so you'll want to be a part of those. But it starts with this offering, this gift. Now, you can do that here in the offering plates, of course. You can handle that to a staff member or an usher. Just be sure it's marked clearly, because otherwise it'll go into the church fund and not into the International Mission Board's fund. So be sure you do that very clearly. I've advertised quite extensively that this service is PG-13. And so I want to reiterate that. If you have children here who are young and love the magical, wonderful stuff of Christmas, I will be talking very frankly about that today. So if that is someone that's here, you might want to go and join the party upstairs. They're going to have a good time up there. Many of you thought, PG-13, that's weird at church. That's weird. And you came in and you saw the chairs scooted all the way back, and you thought, all right, we're finally doing it. The praise team's finally going to mud wrestle right here at First Baptist Church. Some of you thought that. Some of you thought, I'm going to cuss in the pulpit, and I hope that's not going to happen today. But it is PG-13 because I wanted parents to think about whether they wanted their children on this frank conversation. And we do need to have a frank conversation, because this series has been dealing with the things at Christmas time that have gotten out of hand. They just simply have gotten out of hand. So we started off this series talking about our pace, and I encourage you to sit instead of sprint at Christmas. Now, take time to sit down and look and see what God is doing, and to watch other folks and learn how God is operating in the lives of other people. And that's an important thing that we can do at Christmas, and not get caught up in the sprint of the hustle and the bustle of the season, right? Then last week, I encouraged you in a different way, a stronger challenge, to have your family to focus some of its resources on giving instead of just simply receiving from one another. And I gave you some ways that you could do that, and I hope some of you have had that awkward conversation with your family about setting these gifts back in line with our finances and our budgets, and not using our credit cards to pay for Christmas and all those types of things, because that's gotten out of hand too. And then today I want to talk to you very frankly about Santa Claus. Santa Claus has gotten out of hand. It's gone way past what it originally started out to be. And I want to tell you that I'm not a Santa basher. I've got a Santa Claus lamp in my office over there, and we do some of those Santa things with our children and grandchildren. But I have been very curious over the last few years, because I like to poke at people and make them start thinking. Very curious how people handled the Scriptures and Santa Claus in their homes, how they handled that and how they justified that, and what extent did they take Santa Claus to their homes, to their children, and how far did they play this pretend game, and how they justified that with God's Word. And so I looked around, I looked at a lot of different people, and I found out that there is as many viewpoints of Santa Claus as there are people. There really are. There's lots and lots of things going on with Santa Claus. I've read some of the quotes by some of the more famous people about their beliefs and how they do things. And so Arlo Guthrie writes, Santa Claus wears a red suit. He must be a communist. He has a beard and a long beard, so he must be a pacifist. And these two things make me wonder what it is he's smoking in that pipe, to try to reconcile the two. Jack Handy from Saturday Night Live says, if you ever have to steal money from your kid and later he discovers it's gone, it's a good thing to do. What a good thing to do it is to blame it on Santa Claus, because they'll not be mad at him. Shirley Temple said she stopped believing in Santa Claus when she was 6. Her mom took her to the mall, or to the store, department store, to see Santa Claus, and he asked her for her autograph. So she was pretty convinced at that point. An anonymous quote said that Christmas is just like another day at the office. You do all the work and a fat guy in a suit gets all the credit. So that's probably some truth there. Victor Borge says that Santa Claus has the right idea. He visits people once a year. And then George Carlin, you know his humor, he said, Santa is very jolly because he knows where all the bad girls live. Now that might be the PG-13 statement of the day, right? All right, so I want us to look at what kind of some views of Santa and how we should view him. How should we deal with him? What are we to do with Santa Claus in our homes if we're trying to do the Christian lifestyle and do things right and honest and on the up and up? So I want to first tell you about the original Santa Claus, Nicholas. Nicholas was a real man. He was a real man. He was a very, very good man. He was an honest, open Christian man. Ted Olson did a study on him, and in Christianity Today, he wrote an article called The Real Saint Nicholas. And I just want to share with you some of the high points that he discovered in his research of this man, Nicholas. Nicholas was born in southern Turkey in a city called Myra. Myra, the believers in Myra at that time are the ones that actually nominated him as a bishop. And so he became their bishop there. And he lived in the 300s. That was a long time ago. 300 years after Christ in that century is when he lived. He was born to a wealthy family. His mom and dad had lots of money. They were loaded, had lots of money. And they died while he was young. He inherited all of it and kept none of it. He gave it all away. It's an amazing story about him and his finances. The most famous story of his life, though, and where we start some of our traditions with Santa Claus, is that he had heard of some of his parishioners who were not doing very well financially. In fact, they were about to go under. And as lots of Christians in that time, lots of church people who went under, it was just kind of tradition that you did whatever it takes to keep your family alive. So there was this family that had 3 teenage girls. They had no money to pay a dowry so that they get married. At that time, the father had to pay a dowry so that their daughters could be married. And he didn't have any money for them to be married. He couldn't care for them. He and his wife were starving. They weren't eating. There was nothing to do. And so to save the lives of his 3 teenage girls and to save the life of he and his wife, he decided to sell his girls into prostitution. PG-13, right? Sell his girls into prostitution. And Nicholas was so tore up about this that one night in the middle of the night, he ran to this man's house and he threw a bag of gold through the window into their living room. And the father was still up because he was praying that God would intervene for their family. And he would not have to make this hard decision to keep his girls and his wife and himself alive. And the gold came through the window, hit the floor. He jumped up immediately, went to the window, and he saw Nicholas running away. And he said, I know it's you, Nicholas. I know it's you. Thank you. You have saved my family. And so the legend of Nicholas began. Now, it actually started when he was a little bit younger. They called him Nicholas the Wonder Worker, and I'm not sure what that means, and this author didn't go on about that, but evidently he had done some miraculous things that children just normally do not do, which gained all of the notoriety and the fame from the area, and so they looked up to him, and so it was a natural thing for them to elevate him to the status of bishop. And he took his job very, very seriously. So seriously that, in fact, when Rome got a couple of new emperors, Diocletian and Maximian, when they began their persecution of Christians, he was one of the main ones that they went after, and they imprisoned him. And a lot of the other bishops that were zealots, were serious about their faith. And it wasn't until Constantine came along that he introduced Christianity into society, and he released the bishops, and the bishops came out and began to spread the gospel of God again, of Christ again. And at that time, Nicholas found a new threat, and it was the threat of Arianism. Now, Arianism today is still alive. It's in the Seventh-day Adventist church, and you can find their teachings there. But they believe that Jesus was God's first creation, was not equal with God. They denied the divinity of God. And this spread through Turkey and through Europe and through Southeast Asia, all over the place, except in Myra. In fact, some of the communities outside of Myra were never even exposed to this, because Nicholas fought this tooth and nail, and those false teachings did not come into his area, and people acclaimed him for that. They recognized his importance to the faith. There was one legend that says that when the Council of Nicaea was formed, that's the council that came together so that they could decide what's going into the book, into the Bible, which letters to include, which letters to not include. And they had a whole list of reasons. But they met, and one of the leaders at the Council of Nicaea was Arian. Was this guy who proclaimed that Jesus wasn't divine, he wasn't Messiah, and so they weren't going to include any of the Gospels or the stories of Christ or any of the books that talked about Christ in the Bible. And the legend says that Nicholas heard that he was there speaking, walked to the front and slapped him in the face and called him a liar. Now, I don't know if that's true. Definitely Nicholas could have done that. He was that fiery. But we have pretty good notes on what happened at the Council of Nicaea, and Nicholas isn't mentioned. So I think that's one of those things that we can chalk up to legend. But Nicholas was a fighter for the faith. He was a defender of the reputation of Christ. He fought for the divinity of Christ. He was a very, very good man. In fact, in the 900s, well after his death, the Greeks heard of him, and they wrote that the West as well as the East acclaims and glorifies him, talking about Nicholas. Wherever there are people, his name is revered, and churches are built in his honor. There were churches built in his honor all over Europe. He was a very, very famous person. Christians Catholics today are still praying to Saint Nicholas now for his protection and his gifts. And they have some of Saint Nicholas's bones. They call them relics. And they've been in Italy since, well, forever. Since they first discovered them, they moved them to Italy. Well, the Orthodox Church is the one that's separated from the Catholic Church. And the Orthodox Church is still very big in Russia. And just this year, just last month, Vladimir Putin asked if they would please loan the relics of Nicholas to Russia, to their head church in Russia, so that people could pay their respects to him. Would they please loan that? And the Pope agreed. And the rib bone of Nicholas went to Russia. And the line to walk past that bone was over 2 miles long. 2 miles of people in line waiting to walk past the rib bone of St. Nicholas in Russia. He's a big deal. He's a very big deal. Now, it's gone way past what even he would say is praiseworthy and even definitely trustworthy. It's gone way past that. He would probably not be happy with the way that he is being portrayed now. But you can understand that with that kind of popularity, when it spread to the more Germanic countries, that kind of popularity, that kind of notoriety began to, over the years, begin to mix with a false god named Odin. And Odin and St. Nicholas began to intermix their powers. And so it began with this man who stood up for the faith, but now he has some powers like Odin, the the gift of stopping time and doing miraculous things and making things appear and changing the weather and training different types of creatures mentally, and all of those things begin to sort of creep in the Germanic countries. And then after that, especially in Holland, after the Reformation, and Martin Luther came in, and Martin Luther said, we're going to separate from the Catholic Church. We're going to start a Protestant faith, and that's formally that we can go before God ourselves. We can read the Scriptures ourselves. We have a personal relationship, personal responsibility ourselves with God, and he separated from the Catholic Church and replaced St. Nicholas in the forefront of their worship. Nobody was ever painted or talked about more than St. Nicholas except for Mary herself in the Catholic Church. That's how big of a deal he was. And Martin Luther replaced St. Nicholas with the gift giver, the life gift giver of Christ, and began to focus his attention on that and taking it away from St. Nicholas. And everywhere all over Europe, that began to happen except in Holland. Holland really held on to this Germanic teaching about the legacies and the life of St. Nicholas and how it was intertwined with Odin and all those things. And so St. Nicholas became Sinterklaas in Holland. Of course, that's where we get Santa Claus. Some other Germanic countries, or not countries, but little cities still held on to that too. And so they would call him Christkindl, which is where we get our name, Kris Kringle, right? And so this evolution of Santa Claus has been going on for centuries. For centuries. It's not a new thing. But because of that, because he's been around so long, of course the stories have grown, and the modern day Santa Claus trumps everything. At Christmas time, it trumps the discussions, trumps the celebrations, trumps everything. If you go to an elementary school, Lauren or Kynard or Griggs or Bethel or Bethany or the others, we got a lot of them around here. If you go to any of those and say, who's going to make you happy on December 25th? Every child will say, Santa Claus. Santa Claus trumps Jesus. Today's culture, Santa Claus absolutely trumps Jesus. How many movies have been made about Santa Claus that we've seen? I've seen dozens. How many movies have been made about the birth of Christ? I've seen one. He trumps Jesus. I want you to know that there's a character in the Bible that could have also began to trump Jesus, and thank goodness he went a different direction, and so his legacy has been passed down rightly before us, and it was John the Baptist. John the Baptist had an opportunity to rob some of God's glory too. Listen to some passages about John the Baptist. He wore, in Matthew 3:4, he wore a garment of camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist, and his food was locusts and wild honey. He wore this long coat with this belt and ate very few things too, just like our modern day Santa Claus. Mark 1:4-5 says, John appeared baptizing in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. All of Jerusalem, all of Judea knew this man and came to see this man at some point in their lives. He was famous. He was a big deal. Matthew 3:7 says, when he saw many of the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming to be baptized, he said to them, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Even he knew who was naughty and who was nice. He could tell the difference. Mark 6:14, King Herod said of Jesus about John the Baptist, he said that this is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That is why he has all of these miraculous powers. The legacy of John the Baptist could have been very similar to the legacy of Nicholas. But what did John the Baptist say while he was alive that stopped that evolution of his legacy in its tracks? In John 1:14, John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." John elevated the fact that Jesus had rank, had authority over himself. Luke 3:15 says, as the people were in expectation and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John, whether he might be called the Christ, John answered all of them, saying, "I baptize you with water, but there's one who's coming after me that will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire." He recognized that Jesus was mightier than him. John 3:8 says, you yourselves bear me witness and say that I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. John said, I am not Jesus. In John 3:30, he puts it all in the right priority when he taught his disciples. John the Baptist taught his disciples, "He must increase and I must decrease." In notoriety, in fame, in legacy, in deity. He must increase, I must decrease. That's why John the Apostle wrote about John the Baptist in John chapter 1 and verse 6 when he said, "There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light, the true light, which gives light to everyone that was coming into the world." John was a witness for Jesus because he recognized his place under Jesus. The modern day Santa Claus does not do that. He does not recognize his place under God. Maybe you've seen some of the pictures of Santa Claus bowing before the manger. I like that scene. That shows that Santa Claus knew that there was someone greater than him who had come on the scene, right? That's the picture of St. Nicholas, not the picture of the modern day Santa Claus. He just doesn't do that. And because of the evolution of Santa Claus, there's so many people in my profession who've lost their minds. They have. They've completely lost it. And they say totally ridiculous things. They've gone from one end of the Santa spectrum to the other. And you've heard these freaks. They say things like, Santa is just Satan spelled differently. Right? You've heard them. They say he represents the Antichrist because he practices black magic. You've heard these wackos say that he breaks into houses after dark when everyone is asleep, and he enters through the fireplace because he's accustomed to the flames of hell. He's even tried to take the place of God in God's judgment. So if you're good, he'll leave you a toy. And if you're bad, he'll leave you a piece of coal from the 7th level. In fact, they would say he's an obese recluse who breaks labor and airspace laws. He spies illegally on U.S. citizens, practices black magic, and refuses to work but only one night a year while unfairly treating animals. How can this man be so popular, yet he stands in the face of PETA and the Department of Labor and the FAA and the FBI and CIA oversight committees, the Presidential Health Initiative, the ACLU, the local police department, every single Protestant church, and God himself? He must be the devil. The only redeeming factor for Santa Claus is because he uses a sleigh, he has a smaller carbon footprint. It's ridiculous. For those who are diehard Santa advocates and those who are diehard Saint Nick slanderers, I read to you 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. Have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. Both sides, equally wrong. Focusing on false narratives. The die-hard Santa advocate and the die-hard Saint Nick slanderer are in the same boat. They've hitched their beliefs to irreverent, silly myths. And it's not right. If you're insistent on these extreme views of Santa Claus, deal with this, die-hard Saint Nick slanderer. How can a person who is dead be Satan? And die-hard Saint Nick advocates, how can you pretend a person, or how can a pretend person be a bigger source of Christmas time happiness than Jesus? Both of those things are impossible. Over the years, I told you I've liked to poke at people and say, how are you going to do Santa Claus with your kids? You going to keep it magical, or are you going to tell them the truth and love God? How are you going to do it? And I joked around about it, but I was serious about it too. Where's the balance for a Christian? Let's make this real personal. Where's the balance for us? I did Santa Claus. I did Santa Claus as a kid. My mom and dad did Santa Claus. It was awesome. I talk about Santa Claus with my grandkids, my nephews and nieces. Their eyes get real big. It's awesome. How do we balance that out? And I honestly wanted to know. How can I still do Santa Claus and yet not focus on a silly myth? How can I be honest with my grandkids and my nephews and my nieces? So I dug, and I wanted to know what the professionals say. And I read all kind of stuff, and a lot of it was the extremes. You can't rob a kid of their innocence and their joy and their magical times, and you can't tell lies to your kids, because if you're not honest about Santa Claus and they don't believe you, and when they find out, they're not going to believe you about Jesus either. So I read all kind of stuff, and I read on both sides. I read all things. And maybe you haven't done the study, but I have. So trust me, you'll find everything out there. The best article I found, strangely, was in a website called Answers in Genesis. I love that website. It's a very logical website. It sets things out, makes things very common sense approach to truth. And so I typed in, when is Santa Claus sinful? Is it a sin for me to do this? And they had an article on that. And this is the crux of the article, okay? Santa Claus is sinful, one, when he's a glory robber. If Santa Claus takes from the glory of God, just like anything else on earth, it is sinful. At Christmas time, there's glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, goodwill towards men. It's God's glory. Anything that steals God's glory at Christmas and any other time in our lives is sinful. We've got to be very careful when we play Santa Claus. Is it taking God's glory? Secondly, they said Santa Claus can be sinful when he is exaggerated beyond truth, because the Bible tells us over and over and over, do not lie. That's a little tougher. But it can be a sin when we lie. I mean, it is a sin when we lie. So when we deal with Santa Claus and an exaggerated truth, or exaggerated falsehood, really, that can be sinful for us. And then they say something, the third category or reason why Santa Claus can be sinful, or instance where Santa Claus can be sinful, I never even thought of this. Santa Claus can be sinful when he's used as a tool for behavior manipulation. As if the Bible doesn't say enough, or common sense doesn't say enough, we use Santa Claus to make our kids behave during December. You better behave. He's watching you. Better not do that. He's watching you. You better not be mean, because the elf on the shelf is watching. Right? And we use Santa Claus and we use his elves and these magical things to make our children do right, instead of 1 Timothy chapter 4 that says, train ourselves in godliness. We're not as comfortable about godliness, so we have to use things that are fictitious to make ourselves behave rightly. That's not good either. That can be sin. So we have to be real careful because Santa Claus can cross over from pretend magical things into a situation where it can be sin for us, and we want to fight against sin in our lives. It's becoming what I say all the time, better than ourselves. Better than ourselves. So what are we to do with Santa? Well, I've received some good advice from that article and from some other places, and I sort of combined them. I want to just give you some great advice. Okay? Talk about Jesus all year long. Talk about Jesus all year long. Talk about Him every single month. Talk about what He does and what good things He did and His legacy and the historicity of Christ and how He loves us and how we're supposed to act. Talk about Jesus all year long. And then talk about Santa in December only. What that tells your children is that there is something that's more important than Santa, because there's something that we talk about a whole lot more than Santa Claus. So Jesus all year long, Santa Claus in December. Okay? Let your kids know that St. Nicholas was real. Tell them about the real St. Nicholas. He's worth it. He was a very, very good man. Let your kids know that He was real and that He saved those girls' lives and that He fought for the divinity of Christ and protecting the reputation of Christ. Let them know those stories. Tell them St. Nicholas was real. He was real. And tell them that Jesus is real. He still fights for the lives of people. He still seeks to save the lost. He still is at work. St. Nicholas was real, but Jesus is real. And fifthly, treat Santa like every other fictional character. Every other fictional character in your kids' lives, and they have a bunch of them. Don't treat them any different. Don't get into the hype and the month-long or 6-week-long thing where you're overextending yourself and over-exaggerating yourself, and you're having to build stories to cover other stories, and don't get into that practice. Now, I don't want to leave you with just, you need to do a better job with Santa Claus. I want to give you some actual practical things. And first, let me just say that if you're a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, this is not your place to tell your children's children or your nephew's children or your sister's children what they're to believe and not believe at Christmas time. Okay, that's a personal thing that needs to come from parents to children. Parents to children, because you have to be real choosy about your fights, because if you say that and your children do not want you telling their children that truth yet, then now you have closed the door with communication from your family, and so you're going to have to pick your fights, and this is just one that you're going to have to let go. Okay, I just want to say that right off the bat. If you're a grandparent, this is not your place to tell your grandchildren. This is their mom and dad's place. Okay? Let's count that as good advice. All right, the first very practical thing that I want to tell you, parents, is that just like last week when I told you you need to have that awkward conversation about gifts in your home, about not using credit cards, cutting back on the gifts, not putting yourself in a financial crisis. I told you to have that awkward relationship with your parents and your children and your extended family and your friends, and just say, look, I can't do this. I just can't do it. Okay? Same kind of awkward conversation you need to have with your kids. And it's going to be awkward when you sit down with your child and say, I need to talk to you. I got to explain something to you. That's an awkward conversation. But when you practice the second thing, that awkwardness goes away, because you realize there are two things that children really, really value. There are two things that children value. They value heroes, and they value you playing and pretending with them. Those are the two things that kids value above everything. They value heroes. Someone's going to come in, swoop in, and save them and protect them. And they also value the fact that you get on the floor and pretend and play with their toys. They love that. So when you're honest about Santa Claus and you tell them that he is a real hero who saves teenagers, who saves children, who fights for the reputation of Christ, who keeps bad people out of the area so that people don't believe in bad things. When you explain that to your child, their idea of Santa Claus, the ways they feel towards Santa Claus will gradually elevate. This man's even more important than I could have imagined. And then secondly, if you will use the word pretend, your kids will love it. My grandkids get on the floor and they say, Poppy, let's pretend that I am this Barbie doll and you're that Barbie doll and we're going to a dance. Poppy, let's pretend that I'm this wrestler and you're that wrestler and we're going to meet up for the championship. Will you pretend with me? And absolutely, I'm going to pretend with you. Your kids want that. And so we've tricked ourselves into thinking if we're honest with our kids about Santa Claus, that we're going to take away the magic of their Christmas and we're going to take away their innocence and take away their childhood, which is the furthest from the truth because your kids want to play and pretend with you. And they want to know that they are safe and there are heroes fighting for them. So do those two things. And that awkward conversation will not be awkward at all. Hey, I need to talk to you. Did you know that Santa Claus's real name is Saint Nicholas? And he was a real man that lived in the year 300. And he saved 3 teenage girls and their family from starving to death. And when he was older, he fought against evil men that were saying bad things about Jesus, whom we celebrate at Christmas and we worship at Christmas. He said they were doing bad things and saying bad things about Jesus, and he fought them and kept them away from his family and his friends. And St. Nicholas was a hero. And I want to keep pretending with you that maybe St. Nicholas is coming here, but he lived so long ago. We're just going to pretend that he comes here. You want to play pretend with me? And they're going to say yes every time. Every single time. So you have that conversation with your kids, and then you tell them James, that verse in James that says, every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shifting shadow. You tell your kid that every single good thing they get at Christmas comes straight from God. We're going to pretend together that it's St. Nicholas, that good man, brought it to us, but we're going to know that it's God. Now, if they get an ugly Western shirt, tell them Santa brought that. But every good and perfect gift is from God. It's from God. You need to have that conversation with your kids. Now, I know that is way past what preachers normally say about this kind of thing, and we tend to shun these discussions. But I think it's very important for us to talk about stuff like this because we're in the business of sharpening one another and making each other better than ourselves. And if we allow the Scriptures and each other to do that, we're better for it. So at the very least, you're going to walk out the front door thinking about this. When I preached this in the first service and I came down the hallway, there was more discussion about this sermon in the hallway than I've ever heard about any other discussion. And you know why? Because it is relevant to today. It is completely in your face today. It's something that we all have an experience and we have a tie to and a memory of and a tradition of, and this is something that's real to us. So no doubt when you walk out, you're going to have those discussions, and I'm begging you, don't stifle them. Don't stop them. You'll be better if you get past the awkwardness and talk about these things together and talk about them with your kids. You're not going to steal their innocence. You're going to reinforce it. Telling them the truth and playing with them and protecting them. And God will bless you for it too. Will you pray with me? Father, I know that your word is absolutely true, and in today's